Hi there. It's December, so I thought I would wrap up for you everything that I read in November, give you a nice little overview, recommend some things you might have not heard of, and have a little discussion about what I learned. I'm Tiff. This is Tiff Reads Books. I read books and then I talk to you about them. So let's start with the numbers because I love the numbers. In November, I read 16 books. This is a high amount for me. I normally read right around 11 or 12. So 16 is kind of me killing it. This month leaned a little bit more towards audiobooks. 9 of those were audio. It was Thanksgiving in America. I was hosting my boyfriend's family. I had a lot going on, so I didn't read as much physically as I would have liked to, or as much as I did in October. The total number of pages was 2,780 pages that I read, physically or digitally, and 97.65 hours of listened. So some of my books were a little bit shorter this month, around the 260, 270 page mark, or and the hours was about 6 to 8 hours on some of my books. On average, though, I had 4.33 stars this month, so I am pretty happy with that. I think it was 9 5-star reads this month, so very excited. Overall, the most number of pages I read in a day was 192 pages when I was reading Stephen King's The Institute. That's a lot of pages for me in a day. That's about 5 hours. I think I read like 2 hours past midnight the night before, and then I read for like 3 hours spread across the day to get that 192 pages. I'm a fairly slow reader. I read about 40 to 50 pages an hour on a good day. It's more like 30 to 40 on an average day. And when I was reading Babel, part of Babel, I was averaging 25 pages an hour, which was because it was just so dense. So yeah, that was a good day for me. My most minutes listened, because I listen while I drive and while I'm doing data entry for work, I can just listen to books. I put them on 2 speed, and most of the time some are like 1.75, but I never listen to anything lower than 1.25 because it's so slow that I get distracted and I don't pay attention. So if I speed it up, I tend to pay a little bit more attention. So some of these minutes are kind of high. It's listening to an entire book in a day. So my most listened minutes on a single book was 576 minutes on Rin Chupeco's The Suffering. That was the entire 9-hour book. I listened to it in roughly 4 hours at work because I listened to it in 2 speed. The next day was 640 minutes divided between 2 books. That was Deadbeat, Druid by, what's his name? David R. Slayton. That was the 3rd installment of a book. Of a series. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then also A Darker Shade of Magic. So I finished Deadbeat Druid and started A Darker Shade of Magic and got like halfway through it. Could not put it down. Was super excited about that one. So those are like per day stats. And then my goals completed. I finished my 23 and 23 in November, which was awesome. Very excited about that. I had set up a goal in the beginning of the year that I was going to read 23 books. I picked what those 23 books would be. They were a combination of books I had already purchased and books that I wanted to read based on YouTube recommendations, Goodread recommendations, and things that I saw being hyped on Instagram. Some were hits and some were misses. I went over that in another video last week that you can check out if you want to. And then I hit my yearly goal of 100 books, which is awesome. I started out the year with that 23 books goal. That was it. And then I flew through it. And by June, I was like ahead. And I was like, oh, I could actually make another goal. I'd read 23 books by June. And then I just started like flying through books. And I set 75 books in like August. And I hit that. And then I was like, okay, let's do 100. And now I hit 100 by the end of November. So I'm going to be over 100 books this year, which is absolutely insane for me. I never thought I would do that after high school. So I'm like on cloud 9 over it. It's ridiculous. And that has been because it's been a combination of audio and physical. It's roughly 50-ish% audio books, but still 50 physical books is a lot. And switching from music to audio, my Spotify Wrapped this year was so so sad because I switched to books over music. Maybe that's a sign of getting old, who knows. So my King reread project, I listened to Desperation this month for that, and for my 10 before the end, I read a whopping 2 books, and both of those were from my 23 and 23. So some goals are going good, some aren't. That means I have 8 books, physical books to read in December, which is 1 more than I read this month. Yay. Okay. So let's get into the books now. I'm going to split it up by genre, I think, is the best way to do this. So let's start with the fantasy books. I read 10 fantasy books this month. I think I'll go through them in the order in which I read them. So I read, on November 1st, I finished off Rin Chupeco's The Shadow Glass, which is the third installment of The Bone Witch, which is such a good series. It follows a young girl as she learns that she's a necromancer, and as she goes through all of her training, and then as she starts to do things to literally change the world around her and how the magic is handled in her society. It's kind of inspired. The way the witches handle their magic is very elemental, and each witch has a different element that they're kind of in control of. Only the witch is only used for the dark magic wielders as kind of a derogatory term. However, they're based on a little bit on geishas, as each of the women that control these magical powers are entertainers for high society men, and they can be requested and paid. They learn songs and dances and myths and all this stuff. So they're kind of well thought of in society. They go through extreme training. There's also some influences of Filipino culture because of Rin Chupeco's background. So I really enjoyed those. I can't give you too much information without spoiling it. The first book is very, very information heavy and spends a really long time setting up the world, the rules of the magic, how everything works. So it's a little slower. This is one where as each book went on, I actually rated it higher. So that was a 5-star read for me, and I really recommend the series. The audio narrators are actually really good, and I really enjoyed them. So then on the 2nd of November, I finished The Watchmen, which is absolutely amazing graphic novel. It's kind of set in a futuristic dystopian type-ish society where we have these masked vigilante heroes, and we have banned them. And so we have these guys who, some of them are actually have some powers and are working for the government, and others were just really wealthy and had the ability to buy materials to kind of Batman themselves. And some in the post banning of these have become corporate monsters. So we have a lot of conversations about power and ego and the acquisition of power and what role capitalism plays in that and how that shapes our society. And it's really dark, and the book is definitely a little bit different than the movie, and it's one of those things where the ending is slightly different, only in the sense of what is used to cause chaos is different. So I really liked the graphic novel because we had kind of a story, a subplot story happening that we didn't have in the movie, and just a lot of commentary. The art is stunning. The color choice is brilliant. I absolutely loved it. It was such a good commentary on how women are treated in society, how the LGBTQ community is treated, especially this is set in the 80s and was written around the same time. So it's very much a historical set in time description, but it's really interesting to look at that about how some of it hasn't changed in nearly 40 years. So I recommend it. I really enjoyed it. That was my second 5 of the month. So I started off the month on a high, and I continued it with Swordheart and Paladins Grace, which I talked about in another video, are my next 2 fantasy listens. They're by Kingfisher, and they're both set in the same world, so I'm going to kind of talk about them at the same time. They're both romances, but they are fantasy first, romance second, especially Swordheart, where we kind of have an unlikely duo. We have a woman who's been extremely sheltered, and she needs to escape from a situation where her in-laws have trapped her in her house, so that because she's widowed, she can remarry back into the family so that all the inheritance she's just gotten will stay within the family. They trap her in the house. She doesn't threaten because they have no care about what she's doing. She finds a sword and decides she's going to take herself out on the sword. When she opens it, a man pops out of the sword, and he's like, none of this on my watch, and what can I protect you from? He's basically sworn to protect whoever the wielder of the sword is, and this is Hala, who wields the sword, and Sarkis is the sword and a man. He's the man in the sword, but he's also the sword, but he's also a man. Very confusing, really funny. They start to go on a mission to go and get a lawyer from the temple to help save her. And it's just kind of them going back and forth across this road between these two towns forever. And funny things happen, kind of weird things happen, some darker things happen. It was a really enjoyable story. I think T. Kingfisher's humor really matches up with mine a lot. So there's just some very childish jokes, but also some really funny jokes. So I really enjoyed that one. That was a 4.5 for me. I don't really like romances, but I really liked that one. Followed it up with Paladins Grace, which I wasn't as enthralled with as I was with Swordheart, because this one was technically a little bit more romance heavy than Swordheart was, but we were following a paladin who is kind of no longer a paladin because his god has died. And so he's kind of cursed with this rage, like a berserker type rage that the paladins can control when their god is alive. But since his god is dead, he can't control that rage anymore, and he's gone to live in the Temple of the Rat God, which in Swordheart is where we go to get a lawyer. The Rat God employs a lot of lawyers and clerks and things like that are kind of drawn to the Rat God. The dog doesn't like that I'm talking animatedly, so he's going to start squeaking here. So that is the first in the Saint of Steel series, which apparently is a 3-part series that you don't necessarily need to read in order, but you can. I might read the other ones eventually. They were enjoyable, lighthearted, and fun. So that's Swordheart and Paladin's Grace. I gave Paladin's Grace a 4. I did have some issues with how the women were after I read the second one, and then also comparing it to Nettle and Bone, and I did that in a video where I discussed how T. Kingfisher writes her women in those 3 novels to be kind of sheltered and shy and inexperienced, and while that can be a good representation, it's nice to see that, especially with them all being older and in their 30s. I feel like she's just rewriting the same character, so I'd like some variation. So I gave a longer talk about that in another video. So then I read Babel, so my second physical read of the month. Babel is a historical dark academia fantasy that follows a young boy who has been kind of stolen from China and brought to the UK, where he is raised in an academic environment in order to be a translator, because translators are, sorry, I'm very itchy at the moment. Translators are super important in this society because they translate and compare and contrast words on a piece of silver, which is the physical, literal brickwork of society that allows the upper echelons to do things more simply by using magic. So, however, this part of the academic environment tends to solely work on immigrants, and it's the only way that immigrants are really allowed to be in the society, as we're set in the 1800s. So it was a really good analysis of academia and how it interacts with politics, racism, classism, and colonialism, and how those are all intertwined into the foundations of our academic world in the US and the UK. Hugin, please stop. I'm just talking. It's okay. I'm not upset. Anyway, sorry for the dog interruptions. So, so we follow him as Robin is his name. We never get revealed his actual name. It's his chosen name. So we get revealed how everything happens as he learns it. And it is darker than I expected and more violent than I expected, which, because on the cover of the one I have, it says Babel and Arcane History, but when you open it up on the inside, which I hadn't done, it says, or the necessity of violence. And so it's a really good conversation about all sorts of things that relate to that. I did a longer video on it that if you want to know more of my thoughts, you can go check out. So that was a 5-star for me. R.F. Kuang's writing is something I'm going to be looking for more of next year. I'm really interested in checking out the Poppy War, so I'm going to be doing that because I am a fan. So after that, I followed it up with Godkiller, which I finished in 2 days because I hated it. And I did a longer video on that as well. We are following a character whose name I can't really remember because I didn't really care. She was extremely edgy. We started off with her losing her family, becoming an orphan, her witnessing it, and this causing her to be an angry person. I understand we have some PTSD However, I have played D&D with many people who have made this character, because then she grew up in an orphanage where she was taught to steal to bring wealth into the orphanage, or the one foster woman, whatever, because she had other orphans that she did the same thing with. So it's just like, okay, you made an edgy rogue. And we were reminded that she was edgy by the fact that she swore all the time, and as someone who swears quite often, you need to read the room and know when you can and when you can't. And it just kind of made it come off as the character was like just swearing to prove a point, that she wasn't like the other girls. And I just really struggled with it. There was like a gratuitous sex scene that gave us nothing to the story. And it was just, the world building was not good. I have talked about this twice now in 2 other videos. So you can see my longer video on it, or you can look at my 5 like biggest disappointments video, where I talked about it as well. So that was my first letdown of the month. That was a 1.5. I followed it up with Deadbeat Druid, which is the 3rd book in the Adam Binder trilogy. It may be more books later. The author has said in an interview that he wanted to do more, but they haven't been officially announced as far as I'm aware. This follows Adam Binder, who is a witch from a long line of witches, and in the 1st book, he is hunting down this warlock who he thinks might be his dad, and he has just gotten into his powers. His aunt is teaching him how to use them, and he gets asked by his estranged brother to go to Colorado and help save his sister-in-law, who is experiencing some weird paranormal stuff. One of Adam's gifts is that he can see the other realm, the veil between worlds, so ghosts and also the fae that live just on the other side. And Adam has all these powers that his brother and his mother sent him to an institution for when he was a child. So there is some family trauma, there's some estrangement, and on top of that, Adam and his family are originally from Oklahoma, and Adam is gay. So there is some issues with how his family has accepted him and how his community accepts him due to that, in addition to his supernatural powers. So it's a really good exploration of those things without it being very just kind of like depressing LGBT lit, where it's not just him being abused constantly over it or constantly like treated terribly. He actually is kind of overcoming a lot of that, and he's overall, considering everything he's been through, such a well-adjusted character that I really enjoyed him and continued with the series. The 1st book was better for me than the last book. I thought was a little bit of a disappointment, that is a little anticlimactic from everything that we'd seen. So I really do hope the series continues and maybe improves in the next book. But overall, it was a kind of a heartwarming, cute story, considering it was dark and urban fantasy at the same time. There were some really wholesome, emotional moments that I really enjoyed. Conversations about relationships with not only partners, romantic partners, but also family and friends as well. And I really enjoyed that analysis. I also on the same day finished Anansi Boys. I have no idea how to pronounce it because I keep doing it either way. This follows after American Gods. We follow the son of Mr. Nancy, who is Anansi, the spider god, and it is one of his sons, and his son was estranged from his father, and he's just found out that his father died, and when he goes to the funeral, he gets some information that he once had a brother, and he doesn't remember this brother. Obviously, he's never seen him as in his adult life since he's forgotten about him. The character we follow, whose name I can't remember off the top of my head because I'm really never good at remembering names, he is kind of average. He's your average guy. He lives an average life with an average job, and he's about to get married, and then he discovers his brother, and everything goes to shit. And it is a kind of comedy of errors type of story where everything that can go wrong will go wrong to the main character, and it is, can he fix it? Can he overcome it? Can he come into himself and deal with his emotional issues with his father so that he can fix his life? And I really enjoyed that part of it, as well as the fantastical elements and everything that went along with that. So I really recommend it. Neil Gaiman is a really good writer, especially when it comes to like comedy of error type stories. It had a lot of the similar pacing of good omens and a little less of the seriousness of American Gods. So I really enjoyed that one. You don't have to read American Gods to have read it. Storygraph and Goodreads both have it as American Gods too, but it's not a sequel. It's just set in the same world. So I really recommend it. And then I followed that up with V.E. Schwab's A Darker Shade of Magic, which was another audiobook. I flew through this one. I really enjoyed it. We are following two characters whose names, again, I cannot remember. But we are set in a world where we have 4 Londons. We have Red London, White London, Grey London, and Black London. And Black London has been taken off the map. Each of these Londons are in parallel universes where magic has a different type of impact in the world. In Grey London, it's kind of our London. Magic doesn't exist. Everything's pretty standard. And we're set somewhere, I think, around the 1800s-ish based on kind of the way the environment is described. I love a good Victorian London story. So this was set in that, but also with some magic. Our main character who we follow is kind of like a magician. He's able to go through the parallel worlds, and he kind of acts as a messenger between the royal court of the 3 Londons. On one of his last trips, he ends up finding a relic from Black London that is pretty not good. Black London doesn't exist anymore because they let the magic rule them and take control. White London has, because of that, was the closest one to Black London, so they were kind of involved in all of this and are not so great people, and we get a conflict there between our main character and the court of Grey London, as well as a kind of stray that he picked up in Grey London who was like, nah, I saved your life. You are taking me to this other London that exists that I know nothing about because I needed an adventure and you're going to take me. And I loved her. She was very like, she knew who she was, she knew what she wanted, and that didn't change. We didn't have this whole, oh, she falls in love with our other main character, so she changes and softens, which I have had commentary on so much in my life that I was so excited to see a character who was independent and strong and knew who she was, and she stayed that way. A man didn't change that, and I was so excited about that part of it. So this is another series that I'm looking forward to finishing. My friend has them, and she keeps messaging me. She's like, do you want me to bring them? Do you want me to bring them? I'm like, stop trying to distract me from my goal of this stack of books up here. Please stop trying to distract me. And she thinks it's funny. So, yeah, I am looking forward to completing that next year. Probably one of the first few things that I do. I really, really liked it. Then I read an arc of a graphic novel called The Mushroom Knight. The art was absolutely stunning. The synopsis sounded good, so I picked it up. And the graphic novel was very confusingly written, and I wasn't quite sure what was happening. So I can't exactly tell you what was happening. I can tell you the art was stunning. And the colors were amazing. I absolutely fell in love with the artist and the artistry, and I want some prints of these things. But the story itself, we're following a sentient mushroom who is of a race where there's like 3 different types of protectors you could be if you're part of this mushroom race, and ours, whose name I can't remember because it's really weird, is a Gardner. And so he's in charge of making sure that life stays in balance. And something has happened that we are unsure of what it is that is starting to change the balance. And that involves this kind of magical gem that seems to have been lost. And then there's a side story going on of this human girl who has lost her dog, and she stumbles into our Gardner, and now she's not sure if they're real or fake. And that's where it ends. There was no like actual really conflict in this story, so it was kind of weird to have it as the standalone first issue because it seemed to just kind of be like info dumps of stuff. There was too much text on a lot of the pages, and the way that the characters spoke made the text really confusing to follow. I had to reread things a few times to be like, wait, did I miss something? And no, I didn't miss something. It was just really unclear. So hopefully some changes are made before it's actually published in the dialogue, because my take on it seems to be pretty consistent with the other few reviewers who have posted their reviews of it, is that it's overly wordy and in a way that's undescriptive. So hopefully some of the dialogue is changed. The art, again, is absolutely stunning. I put some up here, hopefully. So, my last, I think it's my last fantasy. Okay, my last fantasy of the month. I read a lot of fantasy this month. I've been putting off my fantasy till the end of the year, was Songs of Love and Death, which is right behind me there. This is a collection of short stories edited by George R. R. Martin and Gardner Dozois. Some of these I really loved, some of them I really didn't. I did a vlog on reading them, and there's a few standouts for me. A lot of these were focused on romance and fantasy, and I think they leaned a little too heavy into the romance in some of them for me to actually enjoy them. There was actually, I think, 4 or 5 historical romances, which to me aren't high enough fantasy for me to actually like enjoy them. I'm not really a romance reader. I need there to be other things going on for me to enjoy the romance. So I was really struggling, and I also struggle with when it's a 30-page story and the characters just meet and fall in love in that 30 pages. That's too quick for me. I need to know why, like, and 30 pages is not enough. So I think some I really struggled with, some I really enjoyed. There's a Neil Gaiman story in there where we kind of examine imagination and what's real and what's not. And then there's a Peter S. Beagle who wrote The Last Unicorn. His story I really loved. It was like a computer that is able to connect with people from not our world. That was a really fascinating story. And then there was a surprising horror story that I didn't expect to be in there, about, it was a Good for Her kind of, but with a paranormal element, and it was just spot on for me. So check out that vlog if you are interested. I think I have tagged the timeline, so if you want to see any of those 3 stories, you can check them out from the vlog and my comments on them. I've included Watchmen in the fantasy, but it could also be a sci-fi. So I think it leans a little more towards sci-fi than fantasy. So just to say that, I'll jump into my sci-fi that I read, which could also be a little bit fantasy as well, because we have some paranormal stuff in addition to some sci-fi stuff. It's a genre crossing, Stephen King book, The Institute. It's a little thriller, a little horror, a little mystery. He really likes to kind of bend genres a lot. I don't think it's overall horror though. I think it is more sci-fi fantasy type, but there's no like real fantastical elements to it. So it could, I don't know, man. You're following a young boy named Luke who has been kidnapped in the middle of the night and brought to the Institute, where horrible things happen to him, and he is studied. Luke is a very intelligent boy, but the Institute doesn't really care because they're studying him for something else, and that is his low-level telekinetic power. So we kind of learn, this is a little spoilery, but not too much, that the Institute has a habit of kidnapping kids all around the world who have telekinetic or telepathic powers, and they then use them for their own devices. So we follow Luke as he unravels these mysteries and decides that he's going to try and escape, and then we have a wild journey of him escaping, and it's really good. I am one of those, I've said before that I think one of the areas where Stephen King excels the most is when he writes kids fixing a big problem. Like it feels very 1990s kids TV show, very chosen one. Like he writes a lot of these books that if they weren't so horrific, they would be YA, like pretty good YA stories. So The Talisman's one of my favorites. Follows a boy on a cross-country adventure. Jake in The Gunslinger he's a 12-year-old boy as well. Which I haven't read, but follows a bunch of kids. We really get good Stephen King when we write from this, because some of the horror visuals that we get are so much more horrific when they're happening to children, because it's a conversation on power and the like tiers of power, and when you are in a situation that is terrifying and horrific, but also that you have no control in the situation because the person is in a position of power above you. So I think that's why some of his like 80s writing, when it was horrible shit happening to women, are also pretty much horrific in the same way. He likes to kind of seems like he likes to examine positions of power and how those impact the horror of a situation. So there's some torture scenes in here, there's some death, there's definitely check out the the warnings if you're someone who is sensitive to images of children being harmed and abused and tortured, because this is pretty much the horror of the book, is that it's all happening to kids. So that made it a little hard to read in some elements where I was like, oh my god, this is terrible. Like, yeah. So, but it was really, really good, and it was a quest and a mystery and a take down the big bad corporation story, which I really enjoyed. So that can lead us into the last 4 books of the month I read were horror. So I read Stephen King's Desperation as my reread, and I have to show you this. Desperation has a sister book called The Regulators. So Desperation, which I have a used copy here that has some damage on the front, but this is set in a small desert town where a cop has kind of been possessed and killed everybody. And he starts taking people off the road, pulls them over, and brings them back to a jail cell while he holds them prisoner for his future use. And he appears sane and then appears not so completely there. Massive switches in personality, adding in words to like the Miranda rights, just scaring the living shit out of people. And when I first read this, it was like a 3 for me, but this time, this is like a 5. This was horrific, gory, brutal, and like just absolutely wild of a ride that I was like cringing. I was uncomfortable. There's a scene with spiders where I was just like, oh no. Like, there is a scene that made me almost want to throw up. Like, there's some really gross body horror in here. Some just really, this is some strong gore, and we get into the gore right away in this. Stephen King, he does a lot of character-driven stories where we usually spend like 100 pages just with the character doing shit. This one, we jump in. We just jump right in. So, loved this. This has a sister book, which I have also read, called The Regulators. And this is my favorite thing, is that these books were released on the same day. And one is Richard Bachman, which was Stephen King's pen name, and the other is Desperation. And essentially, in this one, we take everything and all the characters that happened in Desperation and we put them in suburbia, and we do the same type of thing. I'm really excited to reread this one next month. This will be my December Stephen King reread, and I mean, come on. Come on. Like, so good. And even the backs of the book, we've got like, yeah, so good. So yeah, this one, these are both read by Stephen King, and his voice is kind of weird. And he kept pronouncing Oregon, and I was like, no, I'm from the Pacific Northwest. It is Oregon. And then he kept pronounced vegan as vegan. I was like, I'm sorry, what? Like, so his pronunciations were wild. Okay. Desperation, The Regulators, some of my favorites. Very old, very dark, very graphic. I followed that up with Horrorstör by Grady Hendrix, which again gets right into the horror, and it has kind of that camp to it that makes it a little lighter, so this was kind of a good little break. Grady Hendrix, his other one that I read too, was just campy enough that it kind of broke some of the moments for me where I was like, oh, because the other one I read focused a lot on religious aspects, and there was a deliverance scene, and because that's what non-denominational Christians and evangelists call a exorcism, is a deliverance, and I have some trauma around those, and so every time I started getting really overwhelmed, there was like something fucking ridiculous in it that made it a lot better for me. Grady Hendrix seems to do that, so if you like things that are just straight up horror with no break in it, I don't know if you're gonna like him, but I liked that there was a little bit of campiness in it. It kind of reminded me of Cabin in the Woods. It reminded me a little bit of Cabin in the Woods, where things were kind of scary, and then we just break. This just like campy ass break that made it a little bit better, because I don't watch horror movies. Horrorstör. So we're in an IKEA knockoff, and it has been built on an old prison. So we get prison hauntings, which I watch a lot of ghost hunter shows, or used to, and haunted prisons and asylums are like the thing that people love. So of course we have, once the haunting kind of starts, we have some characters who decide that they're going to be the next big ghost hunter show. So that kind of added some campiness to it and some fun. And then we have a conversation about retail life and capitalism, because our two of our other characters are asked to stay overnight to investigate this thing so that our other characters, the manager, can save his job and maybe get a promotion. So a lot of conversations about capitalism in the retail world and how that impacts people's everyday lives. And I want to read this physically because I've been like, after looking at some reviews after I read it, the audio is really good because it's kind of, each chapter kind of starts with a description of a piece of furniture this company sells, and they kind of do it like a commercial with the way that it's read. But in the book is written to look like an old IKEA catalog, apparently, where the beginning of each chapter has that description of the item, but also like the visual like instruction of how to put it together. And I'm like, I need this book. This will be another for my trophy shelf. Like, I need it because I want to give it a read physically. I think it'll be really fun. I do wish I had read this closer to Fina, because Fina was kind of the sci-fi version of this. Instead of a haunting, we had a wormhole set in an IKEA knockoff, and I really would have loved to read the two together because they were both such a good conversation about capitalism. The last two I read were The Girl from the Well and The Suffering by Rin Chupeco, which are the original story and the sequel. So we follow in The Girl from the Well, we actually follow from the perspective of a ghost who's a revenant, and she is out to essentially kill off men who have abused children and killed them. That's really good, and I really enjoyed it. And it was really dark. We end in Japan with an exorcism scene, and it's just really, really good. We get to know the characters, we follow them. It's really dark. It's pretty graphic. I really enjoyed the mystery of it all. And then in The Suffering, we actually go back to Japan, and we go to the Okigahara forest. And instead of focusing on the suicide aspect of it, we focus on a potentially hidden city that may have done some really disturbing shit. So we deal with some ghosts instead of the suicide element. So, recommend those a lot. Those were really, really good, really dark, really well written. I especially love The Girl from Well and following from the perspective of the ghost and having it be in first person, and just, it was really good. So those are a little older. They're from 2015 and 2014. So maybe not something you've heard of before, but if you haven't, I really recommend them. They're short too, like 240 to like 300 pages. So really good. That's everything I read in November. Let me know if you've read any of these, or if you have any opinions on any of them, or if your opinions are different than mine, because I would really love to know. And I'll see you later in the week.